Hello and welcome to another Every Tuesday tutorial. In this week's tutorial, we are creating some painted watercolor feathers directly in Procreate. So what you see on screen is exactly what we're going to be creating together. I'm going to zoom in here so you can see we've got a watercolor paper texture in the background, and then we've got 3 different colored feathers. There's that really nice watercolor effect with some additional splatter and then some lettering popped in there to complete the layout. So that is the final outcome, and you can see there's even that texture in the lettering itself. So that's what we're going to be creating together. I'm going to give you the color palette that we're using for free. It's right here. So just click on the link in the video description and you can download this for free. You can notice that there are some colors in this layout that are not present in the swatch, and I'm going to show you exactly how that works. We're actually going to be utilizing our hue and saturation adjustment to alter those colors later on in the tutorial. So these are the only colors that you will need to complete this entire outcome within Procreate. So the brushes that we're going to be using are part of my watercolor lettering Procreate brush set. You can see them all right here. That is a paid set of Procreate brushes. If you'd prefer to use some default brushes within Procreate, you can get something kind of close to this outcome. It won't be exact, but you can play around with the water category brushes right here to get something that's a little bit similar. So you can still follow along even if you don't have the same brushes that I'm using, but just for reference, these are the brushes that I'm going to be using, and you can find a link to those directly in the video description as well. So I'm going to create a brand new document that is 1500 pixels by 1500 pixels at 300 DPI, and then we'll hop in and get started. Okay, I've got my canvas all set and ready to go. The first thing I'm going to do is drop in that watercolor paper texture. That watercolor paper texture, along with 3 other watercolor paper textures, are all included within that watercolor lettering Procreate brush pack, but you can go on Google and you can find your own watercolor paper texture if you'd like. If you're an Every Tuesday free email subscriber, I also gave away one there, so that's a free resource that I offer. I'll leave a link to that in the video description. So whatever watercolor paper texture you'd like to use, go and grab it right now and put it into your document, and it'll make everything look way more realistic. So I definitely recommend using a paper texture for this tutorial. So I'm going to hit the wrench icon, I'm going to hit insert a photo and go grab the fine-tooth watercolor paper texture. Okay, there's that texture. I'm just going to enlarge it so it fills the canvas, deselect, and I'm going to label this watercolor paper. Okay, so now we're going to create a new layer right above it. This is going to be our reference layer. So I'm just going to label this one reference, and then create a new layer right above it, and then just drag this layer beneath your reference layer. So it's above your watercolor paper, but below your reference. And this one we're going to label watercolor. Okay, so we're going to start off on our reference layer. So make sure that one's selected. I've got my kind of brownish reddish color selected. It's this color right here. And then the brush I'm using for this is the round paintbrush for lettering. And this we're just going to sketch out what our feather is going to look like so we can use that as a base for our painting. So in order to draw a feather really easily, you're just going to draw one line down. And then you're going to make a pointed oval shape. So up here, I'm just going to start with a point and then bring it down. And then I'm just going to do the exact same thing on the other side. I like rotating the canvas. That way my hand moves in the exact same motion. Makes it a lot easier. Okay. And now we need to add some breaks in the feather itself. That way it just looks a lot more realistic. You're going to start along the edge and just make kind of a wavy line and bring it to the center, and then just have it come back out. And it's going to get wider as it gets closer to the edge. So it's the narrowest as it hits the center line right here. And it's very random. You just don't want to put too many in. Okay, so that's looking good. So this is my reference layer. And now we can get to painting, which is the really fun part. So I'm going to come back to my layers, head to your watercolor layer, and now we're going to grab our red color first, since it's the main color in our main feather. And what you're going to do is, with the same exact brush, this round paintbrush for lettering, I'm just going to put a few lines in the middle part and at the bottom. And now I'm going to put some yellow. I kind of want it to go from yellow to red to blue. So I'm going to bring in some yellow down here. And then the rest I'm going to put blue in. Okay, once you have all of your lines, and once again, these are all on the exact same layer. So now we're going to smudge them all together, and this is what's going to give off that really realistic watercolor look. In order to kind of preview this as looking even more watercolor-like, you want to change the blend mode to multiply. So where the little N is, just tap on that and choose multiply right there. And now it's going to blend much more realistically with the background watercolor paper texture. So now we're going to grab our smudge tool and select the watercolor bleed brush from this set. And when you come in here, you're just going to push the color around, and you can see how it's starting to look like watercolor because we have areas that are highly saturated and then parts that are much more diluted. So I'm just going to keep pressing and pushing the color around. When you get to an additional color, just kind of blend them together, push the color around, and you can get some really pretty blends that way too. Just experiment and push things around until you get an outcome that you really like. If you end up pushing too far outside of your lines, your reference lines, all you have to do is come to the left of it where there isn't any color at all and just push. So I've got the stylus down on the screen and you can push it back in. So that's a really easy way to keep it within the lines. And we'll do that where these breaks are too. I'll show you more about that in just a little bit. So I'm going to come through the rest of this feather and just push the color around. So I'll speed up the video and then I'll be right back. Okay, now that I've got my feather all set, you can see I've come outside the lines in a few places, so we're just going to tidy everything up before moving on to the next steps. So I'm going to reduce the size of this down to like 6%, and now I'm going to push the edges in. So I just need to make sure I'm coming from a place where there isn't any color and then pushing into the color. So it's pushing the non-color area into the color. So that's what cleans up these edges, if that makes sense, hopefully. So I'm just going to come along the edges on the outside first, make sure all these edges are nice and clean. So it's going to look like a feather once I turn off this reference layer. And then all I want to do is in these areas where there's a break, I want to make sure there's no color in there. So I'm going to reduce the size even more. I'm down to 4% now. And I'm just going to come from the outside and push in, and this will push the color outside of these breaks, which is exactly what I want. So just come in here. Okay, so let's preview what we've got so far. So I'm going to turn off the reference layer, and you can see we've got a really pretty feather coming together, but we're still missing that center line, so we're going to drop that in. So I'm going to turn the reference back on. And what we want to do is create a new layer right above your watercolor layer, and this one we're just going to call center line. This is basically the stem of our feather. So I'm going to grab the brown color again. I've got my round paintbrush for lettering. I'm going to reduce the size of this down to like 10%, and I'm going to reduce the opacity of my reference line. That way it's not competing with my reference line right here. So just reduce this down to like 25% so I can see what I'm doing. I've got my center line selected, and now I'm just going to very gently draw in a center line. So it's a nice thin line. And then down here, if you're familiar with feathers, the stem is kind of thicker down at the bottom. So I'm going to thicken that up a little bit. And now we just need to smudge this so it appears a little more naturally than just this hard line down the center. So I'm going to grab my smudge tool and select the semi-dry wash as my smudge. And this one's just a less intense smudger than the watercolor bleed. So I'm just going to press the color a bit just to blend it in, but still make it obvious that it's a line right here. So I'm just kind of scribbling on top of it. Okay, let's turn off our reference layer, and now we can kind of see how everything looks right here. And then the last thing we want to do to just add to that watercolor effect is we want to add some texture to it. So come back to your smudge tool. You're going to choose the texturizer brush right here, return to your watercolor layer, and this one I have at a pretty decent size. This one's up to about 25%, and I'm just going to tap with my finger, and when I do, you'll see what happens. So I'm just pressing around, and you can see it's smudging, and I'm getting these really cool textures. This is a little too intense for me, so I'm going to undo that one. but you can see what it does. So just come around. If it gets too intense, you can see these lines of the watercolor, which makes it look really, really realistic. So that's what the texturizer does, but sometimes it smudges it a little too much outside of your feather. So if that happens, just undo and then tap it a few more times and you'll get an outcome that you like. So that's looking pretty good to me. It's a little messy, which I really love, that kind of messy watercolor look. So that's one of my favorite brushes. Okay, so then the last thing we want to do is just add some splatter to it to make it look that much more finished and polished as a final piece. So I'm going to come back to my brushes. I'm going to choose my splatter bleed brush and then choose my blue color first. This size is about 9%. And then I'm just going to use my stylus and then paint in some splatter on it. And then I'm going to come to my red. So now we want to group our watercolor with our center line together. So just toggle your center line layer to the right and then choose group. And this is going to be our red feather. So I'm just going to tap this and rename red feather. And now we're going to make a copy of this. So slide this to the left, choose duplicate, and we are going to select it. So grab your arrow tool right up here. We're just going to move it to the edge. And I've got my magnetics turned on, which is helpful for scaling. It'll scale it uniformly so it looks more natural. So I'm just going to reduce the size of this one because I want this feather to be the center point or the main focal point of the piece. And then I'm just going to rotate this feather a little bit. You can totally draw additional new feathers if you'd like, but for the sake of time, I'm going to show you this little trick with changing up the color for your other feathers. So that's why I'm duplicating these ones, but you can totally just redraw brand new feathers if you'd like. Okay, so now that this feather is in place, we're going to come to the new feather group, toggle it down, choose the watercolor layer on this. It won't work if the group is selected. You have to select the watercolor layer and then come over here to your magic wand and choose hue, saturation, and brightness. And now I can slide this hue slider right here and it'll change the color or change the hue. So you can see all the different colors that I can get out of it. So I'm going to come to about almost all the way to the right. So I'm kind of getting it blue and teal and brown. And then I'm going to reduce the saturation. It's just a little oversaturated for me. So I'm going to reduce the saturation so it looks a little more natural, and that looks good. So now I'm going to label this one blue feather. Okay, and we're going to do the exact same thing that we just did. So I'm going to toggle this over to the left, choose duplicate, and then drag this one over to the left. I'm actually going to reflect this so it looks a little bit different. So hit flip horizontal down here. And now I can rotate it so it seems a little bit more straight. So that's looking good. And now we want to return to our layer, toggle it down, choose the watercolor layer, and then come back over to your magic wand and choose hue, saturation, and brightness. And now we're going to change the color of this one. I'm going to go more towards like a green right here and then reduce the saturation. So that feels good. I'm going to label this one green feather. Okay, now it's time to add in our lettering and then we'll just reposition our feathers around the lettering to make everything feel really balanced. So I'm going to create a new layer right above my green feather. I'm going to label this one lettering. I'm going to grab my brown color again. And then in my brushes, I'm going to select my round paintbrush for illustration for this one, and then just drop in whatever type of phrase that you would like this to say. I'm going to write out "give thanks." Okay, I'm going to rotate this one just a little bit. It felt like a little too much at an angle. I'm going to move this up a little bit, and then I'm going to grab all my feathers and reposition them. Okay, and then the last thing I want to do is just change the blend mode of my lettering to multiply so it matches the blend mode of my feathers. So right with my lettering, change this to multiply, and now that blends in a little nicer with the background. And that looks great. One thing I want to mention is if you reduce the size of one of your feathers, you don't want to increase the size later on. So once you go small, you don't want to go big anymore. Otherwise, you're going to be stretching those pixels and it'll make the feather really blurry when you do that. You do not want to stretch pixels. So always keep your feathers at the largest size that you'll need them at. Once you reduce the size, do not enlarge them after that. So you can always go down, but don't go back up. So that is how to paint colorful watercolor feathers directly in Procreate. Procreate. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit the like button, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you can be notified of new tutorials just like this one in the future. Once again, the free color palette is listed right in the video description, as well as links to everything mentioned within this video, including that watercolor lettering brush set. For more Procreate tutorials and freebies, head on over to my site, every-tuesday.com. If you decide to try this out and post it on Instagram, I would love it if you tag me. My handle is everytuesday. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next week.